So today we're going to dive into a question that is, to put it mildly, incredibly complex. Who are the Palestinians? But we're going to look at it through a very specific and frankly unusual lens. We're deconstructing an interpretation that tries to find the answer entirely within Scripture. Let's get into it. I mean, this question is right at the center of one of the world's most lasting and difficult conflicts. But the source material we're examining today, it kind of sidesteps all the modern geopolitics, the history books, and instead offers an answer it says is purely theological. And I want to be really clear about our goal here. In this explainer, we are not trying to prove this argument right or wrong. Not at all. Our purpose is just to understand its architecture, how it's built piece by piece, using Scripture to create a very specific narrative. We're just explaining the argument itself.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for breaking this down. First, we'll look at how the text defines the protagonist, the true Yisra'Єl. Then, of course, the antagonist. After that, we'll see how this whole spiritual drama gets mapped onto the current conflict in Gaza. And finally, we'll look at the author's prophesied conclusion to it all.
So to understand this interpretation, you really have to start with its characters. The narrative kicks off by defining a protagonist, and it does this by drawing on the writings of the Apostle Paul to define who the author calls the true children of Israel. The author uses this exact passage from the book of Romans as a kind of cornerstone for the whole argument. You have the Apostle Paul here listing all these divine rights and promises that he says belong to his people, the children of Yisra'Єl. It creates a foundational definition, and that quote gets broken down into what is essentially a checklist of identity. According to this logic, these 8 attributes become the non-negotiable defining characteristics of the protagonist. They are the inheritors of the covenants, the promises, and even the direct bloodline of the Messiah. But then the author adds a layer of complexity using this quote from Isaiah. See, the protagonist isn't painted as some perfect, flawless figure. Not at all. Instead, they're described as a people in crisis. Their land is desolate, their sins are scarlet, but they still hold on to this promise of redemption. So, after setting up the protagonist, the author turns to the antagonist. And to do this, the argument pulls some of its most powerful and, let's be honest, most charged language directly from the book of Revelation. And this is really the pivotal question the author poses. They've built the scriptural definition of Yisra'Єl from ancient texts, and now they're going to apply that definition to the world as it is today, which leads to a pretty dramatic and very binary conclusion. This slide really lays out the author's core assertion. It's a stark dichotomy. On one side, you have the true Yahudim, that's a Hebrew term for Jews, who are linked to the Messianic line. And on the other side, a group the text labels counterfeit Yahudim, who are identified with some really heavy terms, the synagogue of Satan, Gog and Magog, and even specifically the Ashkenazi who lie. So you might be wondering, where does this kind of terminology even come from? Well, the author points directly to this verse in Revelation. This is the source for that phrase, congregation of Satan, a term that's applied to those who say they are Yahudim and are not. And the point is driven home with another passage from the very next chapter of Revelation. The author uses this repetition to argue that this isn't just an isolated phrase, but that it's a recurring theme that's meant to identify a very specific group of people. The final link in this chain of logic is another verse, again from Revelation. This one connects the congregation of Satan to the figure of the great dragon, who is also identified as the devil and Satan. And with that, the scriptural definition of the antagonist is complete. Okay, so with the protagonist and antagonist now defined in these very specific scriptural terms, the author then takes this framework and applies it directly to a modern conflict. So, this is the crucial move. In the author's interpretation, the war in Gaza is completely reframed. It stops being a geopolitical dispute or a fight over territory, and it becomes a prophesied spiritual battle between the two entities that have just been identified using Scripture. To ground the spiritual interpretation in an actual physical place, the author points to prophecies that mention specific locations. Here, a reference to Ashkelon, which is a city right near Gaza, is presented as evidence connecting this ancient prophecy directly to the region today. And this is followed by an even more direct geographical link from the book of Amos. The prophecy mentions Azza, which is the Hebrew name for Gaza. And in the author's view, this just further cements the connection between the current conflict and these ancient scriptures. This brings us to the final act of this interpretation. Because if the conflict is a prophesied spiritual war, then according to this text, it has to have a prophesied outcome and a final heroic figure who brings it all to a close. The narrative introduces one last key figure, the child. And as the slide shows, the author explicitly identifies this child as Mikael, or the Archangel Michael, who the text equates with the Messiah and ultimately the prophesied victor of this war.
This passage from Revelation 12 is presented as the climax of the entire story. The woman gives birth to a male child who's destined to rule. That child then ascends, and he leads the forces of heaven in a final, victorious war against the dragon. So, this slide lays out the author's complete prophetic timeline step by step. It starts with the child's birth, then his ascension. The woman is kept safe, the war begins, and it all ends with the dragon's total defeat. This is the sequence the author presents as the conflict's preordained conclusion.
And there you have it, a complete self-contained narrative from start to finish. We've deconstructed how this interpretation takes a modern conflict and reframes it entirely through a specific combination of scriptures, creating a story with a clear hero, a clear villain, and a prophesied end. And again, the key takeaway here isn't the conclusion itself, but the method. It's about seeing how this framework was built, piece by piece, connecting specific verses across different books of the Bible to construct a coherent, if, highly controversial prophetic argument. This leaves us with a final, much broader question to think about. What happens to our understanding of a conflict when a geopolitical event is viewed not as a problem to be solved, but as a prophecy that's simply being fulfilled? It's a question that's definitely worth reflecting on. Thanks for watching.